In the glittering world of royalty, where every gesture is watched and every word measured, some secrets are worth more than crowns themselves. What happens when a queen's desperate attempt to preserve her legacy collides with a scandal that could shake the very foundations of a monarchy? When ancient jewels disappear and fingers point toward the palace's most trusted figure, the line between loyalty and betrayal becomes dangerously thin. This is the story of Queen Isabella's most treasured possessions, a desperate woman's choice, and the airport discovery that would change everything forever. The morning mist clung to the stone walls of Ravensholm Palace like a ghostly shroud, and Queen Isabella Worthington stood at her bedroom window, her weathered hands trembling as she held the telegram that would change everything. The doctors had been clear, 6 months, perhaps less. The cancer that had been quietly eating away at her strength for the past year had finally won its silent war. At 78, Isabella had ruled the Kingdom of Eldoria for over 5 decades, transforming a struggling nation into a beacon of prosperity and culture. Her reign had been marked by wisdom, grace, and an unwavering dedication to her people. But now, as she faced her mortality, a different kind of worry consumed her thoughts, the future of the crown jewels that had been in her family for over 3 centuries. The Eldorian crown jewels were not merely decorative pieces, they were the soul of the kingdom. The centerpiece, the Tears of Avalon, a magnificent tiara adorned with 7 perfectly cut diamonds, each the size of a robin's egg, had been worn by every queen since 1687. Legend held that as long as the tears remained in Eldoria, the kingdom would prosper. Isabella had always dismissed such superstitions, but recent events had made her reconsider. Her daughter-in-law, Duchess Margaret Ashford, had married into the royal family 3 years earlier when she wed Isabella's eldest son, Prince Charles. Margaret was everything Isabella was not: young, ambitious, and hungry for the spotlight that came with royal status. At 32, Margaret possessed a sharp beauty that photographs loved, but Isabella had noticed a coldness in her green eyes that made her uncomfortable. The relationship between the two women had been strained from the beginning. Margaret made no secret of her desire to modernize the monarchy, often suggesting that ancient traditions were holding the kingdom back. She had proposed selling some of the lesser crown jewels to fund charitable causes, a suggestion that had horrified Isabella and created a rift that never quite healed. On this particular morning, Isabella had summoned Margaret to her private study, a decision she would later regret. The study was Isabella's sanctuary, lined with leather-bound books and family portraits spanning generations. It was here that she kept the most sensitive documents of the realm and, in a hidden safe behind a painting of her great-grandfather, the complete inventory of the crown jewels. Margaret arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, her platinum blonde hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, wearing a navy blue suit that perfectly complemented her figure. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years learning how to be watched, but Isabella detected something different in her demeanor, a nervous energy that seemed barely contained. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, offering a perfectly executed curtsy. Despite 3 years of marriage into the family, she had never been invited to call Isabella anything less formal. "Please, sit down, Margaret," Isabella replied, gesturing to one of the wingback chairs positioned before her mahogany desk. "I have something important to discuss with you." As Margaret settled into the chair, Isabella studied her daughter-in-law's face. There was something in Margaret's expression, anticipation mixed with what looked almost like excitement. It struck Isabella as an odd reaction to what should have been a solemn summons. "I've received some difficult news from my physicians," Isabella began carefully. "My condition has progressed more rapidly than we had hoped. I need to begin making arrangements for the transition of certain royal responsibilities." Margaret's eyes widened, but Isabella noticed that the surprise seemed rehearsed, as if Margaret had been expecting this conversation. "I'm so sorry to hear that, Your Majesty. If there's anything I can do to help during this difficult time—" "Actually, there is," Isabella interrupted. "The crown jewels will need to be transferred to a more secure location during the transition period. The current safe here in the palace is adequate for normal circumstances, but with the upcoming changes in succession protocols, we need to ensure they're protected in a facility with enhanced security." What Isabella didn't mention was her growing unease about keeping the jewels so accessible within the palace. She had begun to suspect that someone had been asking too many questions about their location and security procedures. Just last week, she had caught Margaret coming out of the study when she should have been attending a charity luncheon. Margaret's explanation, That she had been looking for a book on Eldorian history had seemed plausible at the time, but now Isabella wondered. Of course, Margaret replied, her voice carefully neutral. Whatever you think is best. Will Prince Charles be overseeing the transfer? No, Isabella said, watching Margaret's reaction carefully. Charles has enough to handle with his expanding diplomatic duties. I was hoping you might coordinate with the Royal Treasury Department. You've always expressed interest in the administrative side of royal operations. For just a moment, something flickered across Margaret's face. Triumph, perhaps, or satisfaction. It was there and gone so quickly that Isabella almost missed it, but it confirmed her growing suspicions that her daughter-in-law's interest in the crown jewels went beyond mere curiosity. I would be honored to help, Margaret said. When were you planning to make this transfer? Within the next 2 weeks, Isabella replied. I'll have my secretary provide you with the necessary documentation and security protocols. The jewels will need to be transported to the royal vault at Greystone Bank. It's a temporary measure until we can determine the best long-term arrangements. As they continued to discuss the logistics, Isabella found herself studying Margaret with new eyes. Her daughter-in-law was asking remarkably detailed questions about the transport procedures, the security escorts, and the timing of the move. While such thoroughness could be interpreted as conscientiousness, something about Margaret's intense focus made Isabella increasingly uncomfortable. The meeting concluded with Margaret expressing her gratitude for Isabella's trust and her promise to handle everything with the utmost care and discretion. As she left the study, Isabella remained seated at her desk, staring at the painting that concealed the safe containing the crown jewels inventory. That evening, Isabella made a decision that would prove fateful. Unable to shake her growing unease about Margaret's eagerness to handle the jewel transfer, she decided to move the most valuable pieces herself, in secret. If her suspicions were unfounded, no harm would be done. If they proved correct, the crown jewels would be safe from whatever scheme Margaret might be planning. Working alone in the study after midnight, Isabella carefully removed the Tears of Avalon, the Queen's diamond necklace, and 3 matching bracelets from their secure display case. Each piece was wrapped in specialized protective cloth and placed in a discreet travel case designed to look like an ordinary piece of luggage. She also removed all documentation related to these specific pieces from the safe, replacing them with fake inventory sheets that listed the items as being stored in a secondary location for cleaning and maintenance. Isabella's plan was simple. She would personally transport the jewels to her private safety deposit box at Greystone Bank the following morning, before anyone discovered they were missing from the palace safe. It would buy her time to investigate her suspicions about Margaret and ensure that the most precious symbols of Eldoria's heritage remained secure. As she prepared for bed that night, Isabella felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She was taking a significant risk by removing the jewels without following proper protocols, but her instincts told her it was necessary. The Tears of Avalon had survived wars, revolutions, and countless threats to the monarchy. She would not allow them to disappear on her watch, especially not if the threat came from within the royal family itself. What Isabella didn't know was that Margaret had spent the evening making phone calls to contacts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, confirming arrangements for the rapid transfer of funds and the acquisition of new identification documents. Margaret's plan was already in motion, and by tomorrow evening, she expected to be in possession of jewels worth over $50 million and on her way to a new life far from the suffocating protocols of Eldorian royalty. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the monarchy to its foundations, but both women believed they held the advantage. Neither could have predicted the series of events that would unfold at Heathrow International Airport in less than 24 hours, or how their carefully laid plans would collide in the most public and devastating way possible. As dawn approached over Ravensholm Palace, the kingdom slept peacefully, unaware that the reign of Queen Isabella was about to end not with the dignity she had planned, but with a scandal that would make headlines around the world and forever change the perception of the Eldorian royal family. The morning would bring revelations, betrayals, and discoveries that would test the very foundations of trust between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, monarch and subject, and ultimately between the crown and the people it served. The crown jewels, symbols of stability and continuity for over 3 centuries, were about to become the center of a storm that would threaten everything Isabella had spent her life protecting. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made the gardens of Ravensholm Palace look like a painting. Queen Isabella woke before dawn, her mind immediately focused on the task ahead. The travel case containing the crown jewels sat innocuously beside her bedroom door, looking for all the world like ordinary luggage prepared for a routine trip. Isabella had spent much of the sleepless night refining her plan. She would personally drive to Greystone Bank using one of the palace's unmarked vehicles, avoiding the usual security protocols that would create a paper trail. Her longtime personal assistant, James Morrison, had been instructed to clear her calendar for the morning with the explanation that she was having additional medical consultations. It was a lie that came easier than she expected, given the circumstances. By 7 o'clock, Isabella was dressed in a simple gray suit and silk scarf, deliberately understated clothing that would help her blend in during her covert mission. She had chosen to wear minimal jewelry, save for her wedding ring and a small pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. The irony of removing priceless jewels while wearing such modest pieces was not lost on her. As she made her way through the palace corridors toward the private garage, Isabella encountered the usual bustle of morning staff preparing for another day of royal duties. The head butler, Thomas, offered his customary greeting and inquired about her plans for the day. Isabella managed to maintain her composure as she explained she would be out for several hours on personal business. What she didn't notice was Margaret watching from a window in the East Wing, having risen early to observe the palace's morning routines. Margaret had spent weeks studying the security protocols and staff schedules, preparing for her own planned operation. Seeing Isabella leave with what appeared to be a small suitcase immediately raised her suspicions. Margaret's mind raced as she considered the possibilities. Had Isabella somehow discovered her plan? Was the Queen moving the jewels ahead of schedule? Margaret's carefully orchestrated scheme depended on the jewels being in their usual location when she initiated the official transfer later that morning. If Isabella was moving them independently, it could ruin everything. Making a quick decision, Margaret threw on a dark coat and sunglasses, then hurried to her own vehicle, a sleek black Mercedes that Prince Charles had given her for their anniversary. She maintained a careful distance as she followed Isabella's unmarked sedan through the winding roads that led from the palace toward London. The journey to Greystone Bank normally took 45 minutes, but Isabella was driving with extra caution, acutely aware of the precious cargo in her passenger seat. She took a slightly indirect route, partly from an abundance of caution and partly to see if anyone might be following her. The morning traffic was light, and she began to relax as the London skyline came into view. Meanwhile, Margaret was growing increasingly agitated as she realized where Isabella was heading. Greystone Bank was one of London's most exclusive financial institutions, known for handling the affairs of royalty, celebrities, and other high-profile clients. Its reputation for discretion and security made it the perfect place for someone to hide valuable assets. As Isabella pulled into the bank's private parking area, Margaret parked across the street and watched through binoculars she had grabbed from her glove compartment. She saw Isabella retrieve the small suitcase from her car and walk purposefully toward the bank's private entrance, where she was greeted by what appeared to be a senior bank official. Margaret's hands trembled with fury as the implications became clear. Isabella was depositing the crown jewels in a private safety deposit box, effectively removing them from Margaret's reach. All of Margaret's planning, the fake transport documents, the bribed security guards, the offshore accounts, would be useless if the jewels weren't where they were supposed to be. Inside the bank, Isabella was led to a luxuriously appointed private room where she could conduct her business away from prying eyes. The bank manager, Mr. Pemberton, was a distinguished gentleman in his 60s who had handled the royal family's private financial affairs for over 20 years. He asked no questions about the contents of Isabella's case, understanding that discretion was the cornerstone of their relationship. "I need to store these items in the largest available safety deposit box," Isabella explained, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was doing. "They may need to remain here for an extended period." "Of course, Your Majesty," Pemberton replied. "Box 247 is available and offers maximum security. It requires 2 keys for access. One will remain with you, and we'll secure the second according to our standard protocols." As Isabella carefully transferred the wrapped jewels into the safety deposit box, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The tears of Avalon seemed to glitter with disapproval even through their protective wrapping, as if they knew they were being hidden away from their rightful place in the palace. But Isabella pushed aside such fanciful thoughts, reminding herself that she was protecting these treasures for future generations. The transaction was completed within an hour, and Isabella emerged from the bank feeling as though a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The crown jewels were safe, at least temporarily, and she had bought herself time to investigate her suspicions about Margaret's true intentions. What Isabella didn't realize was that Margaret had spent the hour making increasingly desperate phone calls to her contacts. Her window of opportunity was closing rapidly, and she needed to accelerate her timeline significantly. By the time Isabella's sedan disappeared around the corner heading back toward the palace, Margaret had made a decision that would prove catastrophic. If she couldn't steal the crown jewels as planned, Margaret would have to create a different opportunity. Her contacts in the criminal underworld had assured her that there were always buyers for royal artifacts, even stolen ones. The black market for such items was surprisingly robust, with private collectors willing to pay enormous sums for pieces they could never display publicly. Margaret's revised plan was desperate and dangerous, but her gambling debts and expensive lifestyle had left her with few alternatives. Unknown to Prince Charles or the royal family, she had been borrowing money from increasingly questionable sources to maintain her public image. The pressure from her creditors had become unbearable, and the crown jewels had seemed like the perfect solution to her financial problems. That afternoon, while Isabella was resting in her quarters, Margaret initiated her backup plan. She had cultivated relationships with several palace staff members over the past year, including a security guard named David Walsh who had gambling problems of his own. Walsh had been providing Margaret with inside information about security procedures in exchange for money to cover his debts. "I need you to create a distraction in the East Wing tonight around midnight," Margaret told Walsh during a covert meeting in the palace gardens. "Something that will draw attention away from the Queen's study for at least 15 minutes. Walsh looked nervous but nodded his agreement. The money Margaret was offering would cover his most pressing debts and buy him another month before his creditors became violent. He didn't ask what Margaret needed the distraction for, but he suspected it wasn't anything legal. As evening fell over Ravensholm Palace, both women prepared for what they believed would be the culmination of their respective plans. Isabella spent time reviewing documents in her study, occasionally glancing at the painting that concealed the safe, satisfied that the most precious items were now beyond Margaret's reach. Margaret, meanwhile, finalized preparations for what she hoped would be a quick and profitable burglary. Neither woman could have predicted that their carefully laid plans would intersect in the most dramatic and public way possible. The events set in motion that day would lead to an airport confrontation that would dominate international headlines and forever change the relationship between the crown and the people of Eldoria. As midnight approached, the palace settled into its usual nighttime routine. Security guards made their rounds, staff completed their final duties, and the royal family retired to their quarters. But beneath the surface calm, tension was building toward an explosive confrontation that would shock the world and reveal secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. The stage was set for a night that would transform a family dispute into an international incident and expose the lengths to which people will go when desperation meets opportunity. The crown jewels, safely locked away in their new hiding place, seemed to wait silently for the storm that was about to break over the monarchy they had served for generations. The grandfather clock in the palace hallway had just finished chiming midnight when David Walsh triggered the fire alarm in the East Wing. The piercing sound echoed through the ancient stone corridors, immediately mobilizing the palace's security staff. Within minutes, guards were rushing toward the supposed emergency, leaving other sections of the building temporarily understaffed. Margaret moved through the darkened hallways with practiced stealth, using her intimate knowledge of the palace layout to avoid the remaining security cameras. She had memorized the patrol routes and timing, and Walsh's distraction was working perfectly. The study door, which should have been protected by 2 guards, was now accessible. Using a key she had secretly copied months earlier during one of her research sessions, Margaret slipped into Queen Isabella's private study. She moved quickly to the painting that concealed the safe, her hands shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and desperation. The combination had taken her weeks to discover, obtained through careful observation and a strategically placed microcamera during one of Isabella's private meetings. The safe opened with a soft click, and Margaret's heart raced as she reached for the velvet cases that should have contained the crown jewels. Her fingers found the expected shapes, and, for a moment, triumph flooded through her. She quickly transferred the cases to her prepared bag without examining their contents, knowing that time was precious. What Margaret didn't realize was that she was stealing carefully crafted replicas that Isabella had commissioned years earlier for public displays. The real jewels, safe in their vault at Greystone Bank, were miles away from her desperate grasp. The fake inventory documents Isabella had planted perfectly supported the illusion, listing the items Margaret was stealing as the genuine articles. By the time the false fire alarm was resolved and normal security resumed, Margaret was back in her quarters, the stolen cases hidden in a secret compartment of her largest suitcase. She had decided to leave the country immediately, knowing that the theft would be discovered by morning and suspicion would quickly fall on those with access to the study. Her flight was booked for 6 a.m., destination Geneva, where her criminal contacts had arranged for immediate authentication and sale of the stolen jewels. Margaret had chosen Switzerland specifically because of its banking secrecy laws and the presence of discreet buyers who asked few questions about provenance. At 4 in the morning, Margaret loaded her luggage into her Mercedes and drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward Heathrow Airport. She had sent Prince Charles a text message claiming that her mother had suffered a heart attack in Switzerland and she needed to fly there immediately. It was a lie that would buy her precious hours before anyone thought to question her sudden departure. The airport was relatively quiet in the early morning hours, with only a handful of international flights scheduled for departure. Margaret checked in for her flight without incident, her royal passport and first-class ticket ensuring preferential treatment from the airline staff. She maintained her composure perfectly, projecting the image of a concerned daughter rushing to a family emergency. What Margaret didn't know was that Queen Isabella had awakened early with a nagging sense of unease. Unable to return to sleep, she had decided to check on the crown jewels in her study safe, partly to reassure herself, and partly because something felt wrong. The discovery that the cases were missing sent shockwaves through her that were both devastating and vindicating. Isabella's immediate call to the head of palace security set off a chain reaction that would reach Heathrow Airport within hours. The theft of the crown jewels was treated as a matter of national security, involving not only palace guards but also Scotland Yard and MI5. Every aspect of Margaret's story was quickly scrutinized, and her hasty departure for Switzerland immediately raised red flags. Meanwhile, Margaret was proceeding through airport security, confident that her plan was working perfectly. The stolen jewel cases were packed deep within her checked luggage, surrounded by clothing and personal items to avoid detection. She had researched airport security procedures extensively and believed she had taken every precaution. The security checkpoint proceeded routinely until Margaret's bags were selected for additional screening, a random selection that would prove to be her downfall. As she waited in the departure lounge, security officers were carefully examining every item in her luggage, following enhanced protocols that had been triggered by the palace's theft report. Detective Inspector Sarah Chun was the Scotland Yard officer who took the call about the missing crown jewels. A 20-year veteran with expertise in high-profile theft cases, Chun immediately recognized the implications of the crime. The theft of the crown jewels wasn't just a burglary. It was potentially an act of treason that could destabilize the monarchy itself. Chen's team quickly pieced together the timeline of events, from Margaret's suspicious departure to her claimed family emergency. When they contacted Swiss authorities to verify Margaret's story, they discovered that no one by her mother's name had been admitted to any Geneva hospital. The lie unraveled within hours, just as Margaret's flight was preparing for departure. The call came through to Heathrow security at 5:47 a.m., just 13 minutes before Margaret's flight was scheduled to take off. Airport police were instructed to detain the Duchess immediately and search her luggage thoroughly. Margaret was sitting in the first-class lounge, sipping coffee and believing herself to be minutes away from freedom when security officers approached her table. "Your Royal Highness," the lead officer said respectfully, but firmly, "we need you to come with us immediately. There are some questions about your luggage that require clarification." Margaret's blood turned to ice, but she maintained her royal composure as she was escorted from the lounge under the curious stares of other passengers. Her mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps there was a problem with her checked baggage, or maybe security had questions about some ordinary item. She couldn't allow herself to believe that her carefully planned theft had been discovered so quickly. The reality hit her when she was led into a private security office where her open suitcases were displayed on a table, their contents carefully arranged. Detective Inspector Chun was waiting, along with several other officials who introduced themselves as representatives of palace security and MI5. "Duchess Margaret," Chun said formally, "you are being detained in connection with the theft of crown jewels from Ravensholm Palace. We need to examine these cases that were found in your luggage. Margaret watched in horror as the officers opened the velvet cases she had stolen from Isabella's safe. Her last hope was that somehow the theft hadn't been discovered yet, that she could claim the jewels were being transported for legitimate reasons. But Chen's next words shattered that possibility completely. These items were reported stolen from the palace safe at approximately 4:30 this morning. Chen continued. Can you explain how they came to be in your possession, and why you were attempting to leave the country without reporting this theft? Margaret's mind reeled as she realized the magnitude of her situation. Not only had her theft been discovered within hours, but she had been caught red-handed attempting to flee the country with what she believed were the stolen crown jewels. The charges against her would be severe: theft, treason, and attempting to smuggle national treasures out of the country. What made the situation even more devastating was the public nature of her arrest. Word of the detention had already leaked to airport staff and passengers, and within minutes, photographs and videos were circulating on social media. The image of a royal family member being led away in handcuffs would dominate headlines around the world. As Margaret sat in the security office, her perfect plan crumbling around her, she couldn't know that the jewels she had risked everything to steal were not even the genuine articles. The real crown jewels remained safe in their vault, while she faced a lifetime of disgrace and imprisonment for stealing replicas worth a fraction of her imagined prize. The airport security footage would later show Margaret's transformation from confident royal to cornered criminal in a matter of minutes. Her carefully maintained composure finally cracked as the reality of her situation became clear, and the woman who had once dreamed of wearing the tears of Avalon found herself facing charges that would strip her of everything she had married into. The scandal was about to explode across international media, forever changing the perception of the Eldorian royal family, and raising questions about the security of the crown's most precious possessions. Margaret's desperate gamble had failed spectacularly, but the consequences would extend far beyond her personal downfall. The news broke across international media like a thunderclap, with headlines that seemed too sensational to be true. Royal scandal: Duchess arrested for crown jewel theft, dominated every major newspaper, television network, and social media platform. The airport security footage, leaked within hours of Margaret's arrest, showed the Duchess of Ashford being led away in handcuffs while her luggage was searched by authorities. At Ravensholm Palace, Queen Isabella sat in her private study, surrounded by advisors and family members trying to manage what was rapidly becoming the most damaging royal scandal in Eldorian history. Prince Charles had returned from his diplomatic mission within hours of learning about his wife's arrest, his face a mask of shock and betrayal that photographers captured mercilessly. "How could I have been so blind?" Charles asked his mother, his voice breaking with emotion. 3 years of marriage, and I never suspected she was capable of something like this. Isabella reached across her desk to touch her son's hand, her heart breaking for him almost as much as it raged against Margaret's betrayal. "We all trusted her, Charles. The signs were subtle, and she was very careful to hide her true nature." What Isabella hadn't yet revealed to anyone was the full extent of her suspicions and the precautionary measures she had taken. The crown jewels that Margaret had stolen were indeed replicas, but Isabella had to carefully consider when and how to reveal this information. The political implications of admitting that she had moved the real jewels without following proper protocols could be almost as damaging as the theft itself. Detective Inspector Chun was conducting the investigation with unprecedented scrutiny from both the media and government officials. The interrogation of Margaret revealed a complex web of debts, criminal contacts, and months of planning that painted a picture of a desperate woman who had systematically betrayed the trust of the royal family. She's admitted to copying keys, bribing security staff, and planning the theft for over 6 months, Chen reported to Isabella during a private briefing. But she's claiming that the stress of royal life and financial pressure drove her to it. Her legal team is already preparing a defense based on diminished capacity. Isabella's jaw tightened with anger. Financial pressure? She had access to every luxury imaginable. What possible financial pressure could justify stealing the crown jewels? The investigation revealed that Margaret had been living far beyond even her royal means, accumulating gambling debts and making risky investments that had cost her hundreds of thousands of pounds. She had been borrowing from increasingly dangerous sources, including individuals with connections to organized crime. The theft of the crown jewels had been her desperate attempt to solve problems that were spiraling beyond her control. Meanwhile, The public reaction was unlike anything the royal family had experienced. Protests gathered outside the palace gates, with some demanding Margaret's immediate execution for treason, while others questioned the security of royal assets and the competence of the monarchy itself. The revelation that a member of the royal family could so easily access and steal the crown jewels raised serious questions about the institution's ability to protect Eldoria's heritage. International media coverage was equally intense. Royal correspondents from around the world descended on London, analyzing every aspect of the scandal and its implications for the monarchy. The story had everything that captured public attention: betrayal, royalty, priceless jewels, and a dramatic airport arrest that seemed straight out of a thriller novel. Prince Charles found himself at the center of a media firestorm, forced to balance his personal devastation with his royal duties. His brief marriage to Margaret was being dissected by journalists and royal biographers, looking for signs of the deception that had fooled everyone close to her. Old photographs of the couple were being reanalyzed for hints of Margaret's true nature, and every public appearance was being scrutinized for clues about their relationship. The most difficult moment came when Charles had to visit Margaret in custody. She was being held in a secure facility while awaiting formal charges, her royal status affording her certain protections even as she faced accusations of treason. The meeting was private, but guards reported that raised voices could be heard through the secure meeting room door. "You've destroyed everything," Charles told her, his voice filled with a pain that Margaret had never heard before. "Not just our marriage, not just your own life, but you've damaged the monarchy itself. Do you understand what you've done?" Margaret, still maintaining her innocence in public, finally broke down in front of her husband. "I never meant for it to go this far," she sobbed. "I just needed money to pay my debts. I thought I could replace the jewels before anyone noticed they were gone. I never wanted to hurt you or the family." But Charles was beyond forgiveness. The woman he had loved and trusted had systematically planned to steal the most precious symbols of his heritage. The revelation that she had bribed palace staff and violated the security of their home made reconciliation impossible. The legal proceedings moved swiftly, with Margaret being formally charged with grand theft, treason, bribery, and attempting to smuggle national treasures out of the country. Each charge carried severe penalties, and legal experts predicted that she would face decades in prison if convicted on all counts. The most damaging evidence came from Margaret's own planning documents, found during a search of her private quarters. Investigators discovered detailed maps of the palace, copied security codes, and communication records with criminal contacts in Switzerland. The scope of her betrayal was breathtaking in its thoroughness and calculating nature. Queen Isabella finally decided it was time to reveal the truth about the crown jewels. In a carefully orchestrated press conference, she announced that the stolen items were replicas and that the genuine crown jewels remained secure. While this revelation reduced the immediate threat to Eldoria's heritage, it raised new questions about royal security protocols and Isabella's decision to move the jewels without following established procedures. "I moved the genuine crown jewels to secure storage because I had growing concerns about palace security," Isabella explained to a room full of reporters. "Recent events have unfortunately proven that my caution was justified." The revelation that Margaret had stolen replicas added a layer of irony to the scandal that the media seized upon. Headlines proclaimed "Duchess steals fake jewels" and "Royal thief fooled by decoy crown jewels." While the news reduced the immediate damage to Eldoria's heritage, it didn't diminish the severity of Margaret's crimes or the scandal's impact on the royal family. Margaret's reaction to learning that she had stolen replicas was captured on security cameras during her interrogation. The moment when Detective Inspector Chun informed her that the jewels were fakes showed a woman whose carefully constructed world had completely collapsed. She had risked everything for worthless copies, and her elaborate plan had been doomed from the moment she opened Isabella's safe. The scandal continued to dominate international news as more details emerged about Margaret's double life. Financial records showed that she had been in debt for over 2 years, long before her marriage to Prince Charles. Investigators began to question whether her relationship with the prince had been genuine or simply another part of her elaborate scheme to gain access to royal wealth. Public opinion polls showed that support for the monarchy had dropped significantly in the wake of the scandal. Citizens questioned how someone with criminal tendencies had been allowed to marry into the royal family, and whether adequate background checks had been performed. The royal family's reputation for dignity and trustworthiness had been severely damaged by Margaret's actions. As Margaret awaited trial, Locked in a secure facility and stripped of her royal titles, the full consequences of her actions continued to unfold. The woman who had once dreamed of wearing the crown jewels at state occasions would spend the rest of her life dealing with the catastrophic consequences of her desperate gamble. Her story had become a cautionary tale about greed, deception, and the price of betraying the ultimate trust. The trial of Margaret Ashford, stripped of her royal titles and now known simply as defendant, began 6 months after her dramatic arrest at Heathrow Airport. The Old Bailey courthouse had not seen such intense public and media interest since the most famous criminal trials in British history. Security was unprecedented, with hundreds of police officers maintaining order as protesters and royal supporters gathered outside the building. Queen Isabella, despite her declining health, insisted on attending every day of the trial. She sat in the gallery, a regal figure in black, her presence serving as a silent reminder of the institution that had been betrayed. Prince Charles, who had initiated divorce proceedings within weeks of Margaret's arrest, appeared as a witness for the prosecution, his testimony devastating in its quiet dignity. The prosecution, led by Sir Anthony Blackwood, one of Britain's most accomplished barristers, methodically laid out the case against Margaret. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage showing her movements through the palace, financial records documenting her mounting debts, communication logs with criminal contacts, and her own admissions during questioning. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sir Anthony said in his opening statement, "this case is about the ultimate betrayal of trust. The defendant didn't just steal objects. She violated the sanctuary of the crown, corrupted palace staff, and attempted to sell symbols of our nation's heritage to the highest bidder. Her actions strike at the very heart of what makes our constitutional monarchy sacred." Margaret's defense team, led by Elizabeth Crawford QC, faced an almost impossible task. Their strategy centered on portraying Margaret as a victim of circumstance, a woman overwhelmed by the pressures of royal life who had made desperate decisions under extreme duress. Crawford argued that Margaret's gambling addiction was a medical condition that had impaired her judgment. "My client is not the calculating criminal the prosecution would have you believe," Crawford argued. "She is a woman who became trapped in a cycle of debt and desperation, whose illness led her to make choices she never would have considered in her right mind. The rigid protocols and isolation of royal life exacerbated her condition until she saw no other option." The testimony revealed the full scope of Margaret's deception and planning. David Walsh, the security guard she had bribed, broke down on the witness stand as he described how Margaret had gradually drawn him into her scheme. His own gambling debts had made him vulnerable to her manipulation, and his cooperation had been essential to her access to the palace's secure areas. "She promised me enough money to solve all my problems," Walsh testified, his voice barely audible. "I knew it was wrong, but I was in so deep with my creditors that I couldn't see any other way out. She made it seem like a harmless favor, just create a distraction for a few minutes." Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Prince Charles took the witness stand. The man who had once pledged to love and protect Margaret now faced the impossible task of testifying against his estranged wife. His testimony was measured and factual, but the pain in his voice was unmistakable. "I trusted her completely," Charles said, looking directly at Margaret for the first time since her arrest. "She had access to every aspect of our family's private life, including information about security procedures and the location of valuables. I never imagined that trust was being systematically violated." Under cross-examination, Crawford attempted to portray Charles as an inattentive husband who had failed to recognize his wife's growing desperation. But Charles's responses painted a picture of a man who had loved deeply and been thoroughly deceived. "I thought the changes in her behavior were due to the stress of adapting to royal responsibilities," Charles explained. "She had expressed interest in our family's history and traditions. I encouraged that interest because I wanted her to feel connected to our heritage. I never suspected she was gathering intelligence for criminal purposes." Queen Isabella's testimony was brief but powerful. Despite her frail appearance, her voice carried the authority of 5 decades on the throne as she described her growing suspicions about Margaret's true intentions. "A monarch learns to read people," Isabella said, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "Over time, I began to notice inconsistencies in the defendant's behavior, an eagerness about certain topics, questions that seemed casual but were remarkably detailed. My decision to move the crown jewels was based on those observations, and events have proven that my caution was justified." The revelation that Margaret had unknowingly stolen replicas became a central focus of the defense's case. Crawford argued that since no actual crown jewels had been taken, the charges should be reduced. But Sir Anthony countered that Margaret's intent was what mattered. She had believed she was stealing the genuine articles and had acted accordingly. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological impact of gambling addiction and the pressures faced by those who marry into royal families. Psychiatrists described how Margaret's underlying personality disorders had been exacerbated by the stress of royal life, creating a perfect storm that led to her criminal behavior. The financial evidence was particularly damaging. Forensic accountants traced Margaret's debts back years before her marriage to Prince Charles, revealing a pattern of risky investments and compulsive gambling that had spiraled out of control. Her creditors included individuals with connections to organized crime, painting a picture of a woman who had been in desperate straits long before she gained access to royal assets. International law enforcement officials testified about Margaret's planned escape to Switzerland and the criminal network that had been prepared to help her sell the stolen jewels. Intercepted communications showed that buyers had already been arranged, with the jewels expected to disappear into private collections where they would never be recovered. The trial lasted 8 weeks, with every detail dissected by legal experts and royal commentators. Public opinion remained firmly against Margaret, but some sympathy emerged for her as a person who had clearly been overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. Letters of support arrived from gambling addiction support groups and organizations advocating for better mental health resources. Margaret herself took the stand in the final week of testimony, her first public comments since her arrest. Her appearance shocked those who remembered the confident, glamorous woman who had graced royal events just months earlier. Prison life and the stress of the trial had taken a visible toll, and she appeared fragile and remorseful as she faced the jury. "I know what I did was wrong," Margaret said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I betrayed people who trusted me, and I brought shame on an institution that deserves respect. I was drowning in debt and desperation, but that doesn't excuse my actions. I deeply regret the pain I've caused to Prince Charles, Queen Isabella, and the people of Eldoria." Under cross-examination, Sir Anthony pressed Margaret about the extent of her planning and the deliberate nature of her actions. Despite her expressions of remorse, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that her crimes had been carefully calculated and executed over many months. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching their verdict. Margaret was found guilty on all charges: grand theft, treason, bribery, and attempting to smuggle national treasures. The conviction carried a potential sentence of life imprisonment, though legal experts predicted she would serve between 15 and 25 years. Judge Harrison, in delivering the sentence, spoke about the unique nature of Margaret's crimes and their impact on the monarchy and nation. "Your actions have damaged not just the royal family, but the institution of the monarchy itself," he said. "You violated the trust placed in you by your marriage and used your position to commit crimes that strike at the heart of our constitutional system." Margaret was sentenced to 22 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 14 years. The judge also ordered her to pay restitution for the costs of the investigation and security upgrades that had been necessary following her breach of palace security. The aftermath of the trial brought significant changes to royal security protocols and procedures for vetting those who marry into the royal family. Queen Isabella, her health continuing to decline, used the scandal as an opportunity to modernize certain aspects of the monarchy while strengthening protections for its most precious assets. Prince Charles, deeply scarred by his experience, withdrew from public life for several months to recover from the betrayal and media scrutiny. When he eventually returned to royal duties, he was a changed man, more cautious in his personal relationships, but also more committed to serving his future subjects with integrity and dedication. Margaret's story became a cautionary tale studied in law schools and psychology programs, illustrating how personal weakness and external pressure can lead to catastrophic decisions. Her fall from royal grace to convicted criminal served as a stark reminder that privilege and position cannot protect someone from the consequences of their choices. The crown jewels, both real and replica, were eventually returned to enhanced security at the palace, where new protocols ensured that such a breach could never happen again. Queen Isabella lived to see these improvements implemented before passing away peacefully 2 years later, secure in the knowledge that she had protected Eldoria's heritage for future generations. The scandal that had threatened to destroy the monarchy ultimately strengthened it by forcing necessary reforms and demonstrating the institution's ability to survive even the most serious betrayals. Margaret's desperate gamble had failed spectacularly, but from the ashes of her crimes, a more secure and transparent royal system emerged, better equipped to serve the people of Eldoria for generations to come. Years later, as Margaret served her sentence in a secure facility far from the palaces and privileges she had once known, she would reflect on the choices that had led to her downfall. The crown jewels that had seemed like the solution to all her problems had instead become the instruments of her destruction, teaching her too late that some treasures are worth far more than their monetary value. The kingdom of Eldoria moved forward, its crown jewels safe, its monarchy reformed, and its people reassured that justice would always prevail, even when crimes were committed by those closest to the throne. Margaret's story served as an eternal reminder that trust, once broken, can never be fully restored, and that the price of betraying a nation's heritage extends far beyond any individual's personal gain.